Fragments of Heraclitus, a somewhat cryptic collection of aphorisms, which are all that remain of their author's work. So, if you don't know, Heraclitus was an ancient pre Socratic Greek philosopher who is, I believe, credited with being the first to have written a philosophical treatise, like a full length book of philosophy, which I believe was entitled On Nature. However, that book has been lost to history with the exception of these fragments of it. So, as I said, these fragments are kind of enigmatic given that they are largely disconnected from any kind of broader context. So it reads like some kind of mystical kung fu type wisdom in some respects. But even though these fragments are so scattered, so again, kind of cryptic, there are nonetheless certain strains of thought which are perceptible in this work, which have been immensely influential historically and which have prefigured later works by other thinkers. So I can't really like summarize this book because it's just a bunch of disconnected little aphoristic statements. So rather, I'll just kind of talk broadly in kind of broad strokes about what some of the more interesting, again, strains of thought are within these fragments. So, Heraclitus is known for having viewed the world as being something which is in a state of constant flux or change. That is, it's not so much that the world is as that the world is constantly becoming. And a thing about the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers is that a lot of them tried to define what the basic essence of like the universe is, what the basic essence of stuff is. And Heraclitus posited that fire was the essence of everything. And this is very interesting. I mean, very interesting because of, again, what it kind of presaged. So, by saying that fire is like the essence of all things, I don't know that that's meant in like a strictly literal sense. Rather, it's reflective of change. Fire burns and fire burns out. But what's so interesting is that Heraclitus says that fire exhausted falls back into things. And once again, this really kind of prefigures Einstein's later discovery that there's an equivalence between mass and energy, right? That matter and energy are effectively the same thing, just in kind of two different states. That is truly remarkable that someone this long ago, I mean, we're talking thousands of years ago, was able to perhaps, you know, wittingly or not, was able to recognize that that there is a connection. There's an there's a kind of entwined relationship between matter and energy. So Heraclitus's dictum that fire is the essence of all things is actually, I would say, ahead of the curve by many centuries, actually. But you can also see shades of Heraclitus's thought in the work of Hegel, definitely in the work of Hegel, and also in Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy. Those were also thinkers who viewed the world as not something that is, but as something that is constantly becoming, that things are always in a state of flux, and that change is the only constant, right? But beyond that, we also see in the fragments of Heraclitus what may just be the first documented instance of the notion of the logos. And of course, the logos in Greek and in later, like Roman Stoic philosophy, is often translated as the Word. And of course, this most famously, perhaps, was eventually woven into the Gospel of John with that iconic opening line: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." But in the Fragments of Heraclitus, we see what I'm guessing may possibly be the first recorded usage of the concept of the logos, the kind of orderly principle that organizes all of creation. Very interesting. I don't know if Heraclitus is like the first who actually like formulated that, but again, I think I think a case could be made that this represents like the first documented usage of that concept. Very interesting. But Heraclitus, for all his prescient philosophizing, was also, I think, kind of dealing with some type of thinking which perhaps is not of the most positive nature. And allow me, if I may, to explain what I mean by that. Heraclitus was, I think, uh, considered to be what is called a dialetheist, which is one who denies the law of non contradiction. That to me is a troubling position to take, because when you deny one of the cardinal rules of thought, that is, when you kind of abandon reason, the very thing that makes reason and rationality possible, you kind of open the door for some pretty nefarious stuff to slip through. Moreover, Heraclitus, as I said, was known for viewing the world as something which is in constant change, something that never really is, but is always becoming. Again, and more than that, he viewed the world as being comprised of opposing forces in conflict with each other. Now, the reason why I say this may not be the most positive philosophy is because I think a lot of negative things historically have been associated with that. And of course, it is no coincidence, therefore, that Hegel and also Heidegger and Hitler as well espoused the same philosophical outlook. Hegel and Heidegger both explicitly credited Heraclitus as being an influence on their thought. But Hitler as well has a strain of Heraclitus in his philosophical outlook as well, because Hitler, I believe in his book Mein Kampf, that infamous work, declared that the essence of life is struggle. And that the policy of the Nazi Party would be to live in a state of perpetual war. This is directly reflective of a notion which is found in the Fragments of Heraclitus, that war is the father of all. That is, because the world, according to Heraclitus at least, is composed of contending forces, and also because, according again to Heraclitus, the law of non contradiction is not necessarily valid. We can see kind of, again, a prefigurement of Hegel's later, very, very detrimental, I would say, notion of the dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? And of course, Hegel also was a philosopher who was not by any means a pacifist, who also viewed war and bloodshed and carnage and conflict as the thing that ultimately like creates when it comes to human society, right? And yeah, I don't think that is by any means a positive position to hold. So while I can respect a lot of what Heraclitus says in these fragments, because a lot of them again are very prescient and truly insightful, certain strains of thought which can be picked up on in these fragments, I think, are rather portentous of some very, very harmful things which later came to be in history due to the same manner of thought. Again, I don't think that it's necessarily the most positive way to view the world as something that never is, but only ever is becoming. and that ultimately the world is just comprised of contending forces, and that therefore conflict and war are creative things. I don't think that's very good at all. And once more, I think it's no coincidence that Hegel and Heidegger and again Hitler have either directly ascribed influence to Heraclitus or at the very least unknowingly echoed similar sentiments. There is a lot in these fragments which still has relevance today, because there are a lot of people out there that still view the world in this manner. And, you know, even though I won't say that I can get behind everything that Heraclitus says in these fragments, I have to say he still has a place in the philosophical conversation today. Even all these centuries, these millennia later, he is still relevant, certainly. So there's that, I guess. But again, I think that some of these notions, some of these concepts, and the perspective with which Heraclitus looked at things, I think has actually been responsible for a great deal of harm historically. And also, it's weird, but you can see kind of, again, a prefigurement of like postmodernism within some of these fragments. It's definitely something once more which still has a place in the conversation, because he was definitely thinking ahead. I'll say he was definitely uh, his mode of thought has never gone away, and once more, it's still relevant today, even though that may not be the best thing, at least in my opinion. But anyway, the Fragments of Heraclitus. I'm not going to rate this because, again, I don't really rate non-fictional philosophical works such as this. But I will say it was interesting, even though I myself see a lot of potential detriment in some of these fragments. They were very fascinating in many respects and insightful too, I will admit. So I'm glad I read it. But yes, the Fragments of Heraclitus. Have you read the Fragments of Heraclitus? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about the fragments. Whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. And if you haven't read these fragments, I would recommend reading these. I mean, for one, these things are thousands of years old. They're well in the public domain. You can probably just read these online. Two, it's not going to take you much time at all to read this. It took me like, I would say probably less than half an hour tops to read all of them, because they're just, again, just kind of scattered little aphoristic statements. But once more, there is contained in these kind of, again, scattershot statements, there is contained certain patterns of thought which have had enormous impact throughout history. And again, I would say not in the best of ways necessarily, but you owe it to yourself to at least, kind of expose yourself to these concepts, because whether you like it or not, this type of thinking has had and still does have a real impact on the development of human society in the course of history. So I would say it's definitely worth your while to read these fragments. But as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.